This video is in a series of videos on biblical hermeneutics by me, Dr. Joe Sprinkle. And this particular video and the next one will have to do with Bible translations. The first thing that one needs in studying the Bible is a Bible. But which one? The King James Version, the New International Version, the Message, the New Living, or just what? And why is it that Bible translations differ from each other? This video will discuss with some examples why translations differ from each other based on differing translation philosophies, especially literal versus paraphrased. So let's get into it. The first thing we should point out that technically, translations of the Bible are not the same thing as the Bible itself. The Bible itself was written in Greek, Hebrew, and Aramaic. Translations are an attempt to render the Greek, Hebrew, and Aramaic into modern vernacular, and most are very good representations of the real Bible. But all translations are at best only imperfect representations of the original. You can see the original Bibles here. You have the Biblia Hebraica Stuttgartensia, which is a standard scholarly edition of the Hebrew Bible, and Novum Testamentum Greek, the scholarly edition of the Greek New Testament. Now, one of the ways that you could approach the problem of translations is by learning and mastering Greek, Hebrew, and Aramaic so that you can study the Bible in the original languages and translate the text for yourself without depending on Bible translations. Unfortunately, most Christians will never have the opportunity to learn the original languages. And even those who study Greek and Hebrew in seminary usually fall short of full mastery of these languages. Thus, most Christians, even those with some acquaintance with Greek and Hebrew, will mostly have to depend on translations of the Bible for their study of Scripture. But translations differ in a variety of ways. And one of the major ways in which they differ is the degree to which the translation is literal and the degree to which the translation is paraphrased. There's a tension in Bible translation between the desire to be faithful to the text and the desire to be clear. Faithfulness means sticking as close as possible to the original text and its wording, while clarity means making clear the meaning of the text. And it's difficult to do both of these things at the same time. So on the left column, I call literal translations. Those are also known as formal equivalence translations. And the goal of a formal equivalent translation is to be faithful to the text and to read as little as possible into the text, translating in such a way as to leave all the ambiguities there, just as they are found in the original languages. A literal translation tries to avoid reading our theologies into the text while translating. The approach emphasizes faithfulness to the text, and therefore we call it a literal translation, tends to be word for word in its renderings. Or again, the more technical term is formal equivalence translations. A formal equivalence translation seeks a word-for-word correspondence between the Greek or the Hebrew word and its English translation. In general, a formal equivalence rendering keeps as close as possible to the word order of the original text and its sentence structure. And this does have the negative effect of making for clumsy and unclear English, since literal renderings, by sticking close to the Hebrew and Greek expressions, express ideas in a way different than English normally would. On the right side, I call paraphrased translation or the more technical term for that would be dynamic or functional equivalence translations. A second goal of the translator is clarity, to render the meaning of the text to the reader just as it would have been conveyed to the original hearer. Translations that emphasize clarity and giving a thought for thought as opposed to word for word rendering is called dynamic equivalence translations or functional equivalence translations. This approach involves paraphrase or interpretation to make the meaning clear. Dynamic equivalent translations reject the formal equivalent translations word for word philosophy because such literal renderings often obscure the meaning by slavishly following the Greek or Hebrew word order. Proponents of dynamic equivalence argue that it is not word for word rendering, but meaning for meaning rendering that best conveys the original. Dynamic equivalent renderings seek to produce the same effect on the modern reader as the original text did on the ancient reader. Literal translations, they say, could never do that. So these are the two goals of faithfulness to the text and clarity, and they are in tension with each other. The more a translation seeks to be faithful to the text, the less clear it will be. The more the translation strives for clarity, the less faithful to the text it will be. And one of the major differences between translations is the degree to which the translation engages in paraphrase for the sake of clarity. Well, let me give you some problems with literal translations and later some problems with paraphrase translations. One of the problems with literal translations, here first of all is a chart that shows some of the standard Bibles that are out there. On the left are more paraphrase, more free, more dynamic equivalents. New Living Translation, Good News Bible, Jerusalem Bible, New English Bible. In the middle are mediating or balanced translations. NIV strives to be more balanced. And then on the right are more formal equivalents or word for word type translations, King James, New American Standard, Revised Version, and the like. Well, what are some problems with literal translations? Well, the syntax of the original wording doesn't always translate well. You have this problem in the King James of Psalm 48 and verse 1. Great is the Lord and greatly to be praised in the city of our God, in the mountain of his holiness. And well, that mountain of his holiness sounds cool, but what on earth does the mountain of his holiness mean? It's rather obscure. It gives you the idea that maybe holiness could be piled up like a mountain. But all Hebraists know that what it really means is his holy mountain. And almost all modern translations since the King James render it exactly that way, since the mountain of his holiness is obscure. And so, again, some syntactical formulations don't translate word for wordish very well. It is literally the mountain of his holiness, but in Hebrew, there's a tendency to use nouns where we would use adjectives. And the meaning here is clearly his holy mountain. And that's probably the best way to render it, even though that's not literally word for word what it says. Another thing, idioms. Certain idioms do not translate well literally. And this, of course, is true of English idioms like it's raining cats and dogs, or speaking about someone kicking the bucket and the like. If you translate that into other languages, literally, they wouldn't have any idea what you're talking about. In English, we say we have a frog in our throat. But the French idiom, I'm told, is to have a cat in the throat. And likewise, certain idioms in Greek and Hebrew don't translate especially well. The King James, which is very literal in Philippians 1 and verse 8, speaks of the bowels of Jesus. And that's literally what the text says. But the meaning of bowels is not just the intestines, but it's used metaphorically of the affection of Christ. And so here, even though literally it's the bowels of Jesus, if you want to convey the meaning, you should say the affection of Jesus. In English, the word heart implies emotions, but in Hebrew, the heart is the seat of the intellect. And sometimes heart, the Hebrew word for heart, lave, should be translated mind. And again, translating it literally heart can be misleading, since we think of heart as mostly emotional as opposed to the head. But in Hebrew, heart is the mind. In Lamentations 2:11, the text says literally, my liver is poured out on the earth. That's King James. But it probably means something like my heart is poured out, New American Standard and NIV, or another view, my bile is poured out on the ground, New Revised Standard Version. And so, again, literal translation is very often misleading. Translation without interpretation is, in fact, not always possible. There's a phenomenon of a verbal form called the imperfect in Hebrew, in which the same form can have a whole variety of meanings. Most of the time, the imperfect will be translated future, I will pray, but it could also be continuous action in the past. I prayed off and on, I used to pray. Or it could be habitual present action, I do pray from time to time. And then there's a whole series of usages called modal usages. I should pray, I could pray, I might pray, I wish to pray, I must pray, I am to pray, I ought to pray. Any of those things are all conveyed by exactly the same form. And so when such a form occurs, and this is quite common, you have to decide as a translator, well, which of the possible senses of the imperfect, whose basic meaning is incomplete action, which of the possible meanings applies in context? And in some cases, it's ambiguous as to what the context should be taken to mean. So, for example, in Psalm 12 and verse 3, there's two possible ways of rendering the verse. It could be rendered, the verb in the imperfect, the Lord shall cut off all flattering lips. That's the King James. But the New American Standard took it as a modal usage and rendered it, may the Lord cut off all flattering lips. Well, is it a prediction of what the Lord will do? He shall cut off all flattering lips? Or is it a prayer requesting that the Lord cut off all flattering lips? Well, it's a matter of interpretation, and that depends on the context. And the context is a little bit ambiguous in this particular verse. It could go either way. And in any case, whichever rendering you choose, you have excluded another plausible interpretation. So you can't really translate always without interpreting. Translation without interpretation is not always possible in this New Testament example too, from 2 Timothy 1:12. This is a verse that's made a little bit famous in a traditional hymn. Yet I am not ashamed, because I know whom I have believed, and I am convinced that he is able to guard what I have entrusted to him for that day. That's NIV, similarly King James and New American Standard. But if you were to read that in the Revised Standard Version, it would say, but I am not ashamed, for I know whom I have believed. I am sure that he is able to guard until that day what has been entrusted to me. So is the verse talking about what Paul has entrusted to God? Or is it talking about what God has entrusted to Paul? Now, literally, the text says my deposit, or even more literally, the deposit of me, which presumably means my deposit. Is that the deposit which Paul has given to God? He is able to keep what I have committed to him against that day, which could refer to his salvation or his soul, as Paul is facing martyrdom in the near future. And he's persuaded that come what may, that he will be saved in the end. Or is it the other way around? A deposit of me, or my deposit, is what God has deposited with me, what he has committed unto me. RSV, New American Standard, New Revised Standard, New Living Translation, in which case it would probably be a reference to the gospel that God is committed to Paul, but even though Paul is about to be martyred, he's confident and persuaded that that gospel would be transmitted on to the following generations. That which he has committed to me, he's going to keep against that day. Well, in choosing one interpretation or the other, you have made a commitment to interpreting it. And both renderings are plausible, acceptable renderings of the Greek. Moreover, both make good sense in context. And when you choose the one, you are necessarily excluding the other. And even if you put the other one in the margin, by choosing one to put in the text itself, you are choosing your preferred interpretation. So that's a problem with literal translation. But then there's also problems with paraphrased translations or dynamic equivalent translations. And the problem is that it interprets too much. So, for example, in 1 Corinthians 7 and verse 1, in the New American Standard, it says that it is good for a man not to touch a woman. And that's literally what the text said. But in the older NIV, it paraphrased it a bit and said it is good for a man not to marry a woman. And that is giving an interpretation of what he means by touch. That means to marry. Unfortunately, I think that is probably not the correct interpretation here. I think what it means by it's good for a man not to touch a woman, it means it's good for a man not to have sexual relations with a woman. And that is even within the context of marriage, not just someone who's unmarried, but someone who is already married. And it was talking about celibacy within marriage in the context. And Paul mentions that idea and says it's a bad idea because of immorality that's likely to come if you exclude your partner in that way. Well, anyway, by choosing to paraphrase, the NIV excluded another more plausible interpretation of the text. Now, here are some translations on a scale of least literal to most literal. The most literal translations are interlinears, where they just take the Greek or Hebrew text and put underneath what each word means. The Darby translation in the 19th century was kind of like that. And then you can see there's a whole series of translations that are primarily literal, King James, New American Standard, and so forth. Some that are middle of the road, NIV, Christian Standard Bible, New Revised Standard Version. There's some that have a considerable paraphrase. There are some that are primarily paraphrased, and one that goes beyond paraphrase would be the old Living Bible Paraphrase. I call it goes beyond that because it actually wasn't a translation of the Greek and Hebrew. It was a paraphrase of the English. It was an English to English translation, and therefore technically it's not a translation at all. Well, what I will do in the next video is talk about the need for modern translations. But this concludes my introduction to translations. My name is Dr. Joe Sprinkle.